There is a detail buried inside the F-35 program that most politicians do not understand, most journalists have not reported, and most of the countries currently operating the aircraft have never publicly acknowledged. A detail that changes the entire meaning of the phrase defense partnership when it is applied to this specific aircraft. A detail that, once you understand it, explains why Canada's Parliament just moved to cancel a $19 billion contract, and why 15 other countries are watching to see what happens next. The F-35 runs on 8 million lines of software code. Every weapon system, every radar scan, every threat detection algorithm, every communication channel in every F-35 operating anywhere on Earth, all of it controlled by a 90-person team at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, the 350th Spectrum Warfare Group. They produce what are called mission data files, the digital battle manuals that tell the jet how to identify an enemy S-400 radar, how to plot a flight path through hostile airspace, how to jam enemy communications in combat. Without current mission data files, the F-35 can still take off, it can still fly, but it cannot effectively fight a modern air defense system. An $82 million aircraft becomes a very expensive display model. Here is the critical question. Does any country operate the F-35 independently? 1. Exactly 1. Israel. Their variant, the F-35I Adir, runs fully independent software. Israeli engineers install their own code, run their own maintenance, control their own missions. Nobody in Florida decides when Israel fights. Every other country on Earth, Canada, Poland, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Germany, and 15 others, depends completely on that American team for combat-ready software. When Canada is described as spending $19 billion on F-35s, the accurate description is, Canada is spending $19 billion on aircraft it cannot operate independently. Aircraft where a 90-person team in Florida decides whether the software works. Aircraft where the country that sold you the jet retains, permanently and structurally, the ability to determine whether you can use it in combat. That is not a defense partnership. That is a dependency contract dressed in the language of a defense partnership. Welcome back. Today we go through the software dependency that most coverage of the F-35 debate is missing, the specific precedents that proved this dependency can be weaponized, the cascading Allied recalculation underway from Ottawa to Berlin, why defense partnerships last 40 years, and why that makes this moment permanent rather than reversible, and what you should be watching in the months ahead. Let's go. To understand why the software dependency matters in 2026, in a way it did not matter in 2015, you have to understand what the preceding 12 months demonstrated about American willingness to use leverage. On January 29th, 6 days before Canada's NDP leader stood in Parliament to call for F-35 cancellation, Trump posted on Truth Social announcing that he was decertifying all aircraft built in Canada. Bombardier jets, regional planes, private aircraft. He threatened a 50% tariff on every Canadian-made plane sold in the United States. The stated reason was a paperwork delay. Canada's aviation regulator had not certified certain Gulfstream jets on Washington's preferred timeline. 5,125 Canadian-made aircraft operate in America right now. All of them were threatened over a safety review administrative delay. The aviation threat was not the precedent that most alarmed Canadian defense planners. The precedent that changed the calculation was Ukraine. NDP leader Don Davies, speaking in Parliament on February 4th, stated it directly. This is not a fictional fear. Donald Trump did this to Ukraine. He threatened to withhold and did withhold parts to the F-16 fighter jet radar and left the Ukrainian Air Force in a lurch. America armed Ukraine, then held the parts hostage during active wartime. Canada watched that happen in real time. Watched an allied country whose pilots were in combat discover that the country supplying their aircraft had decided to condition that supply on political compliance. The F-16 situation and the F-35 dependency are structurally different in degree but identical in principle. The principle is that any country whose military aircraft depend on American parts, American software updates, or American maintenance cooperation has handed a foreign government a veto over its own military capability. In a stable alliance operating under consistent norms, that veto is never exercised and the dependency is invisible. When the alliance's norms change, when the country holding the veto demonstrates it will use it, The dependency becomes visible, and the question of whether to accept it becomes unavoidable. Canada cannot be left vulnerable to the whims of Trump or any future president who could withhold F-35 parts over policy disagreements. Davis's emphasis on any future president is the analytically important phrase. This is not an argument about one man. It is an argument about a system, one where the structural design of the aircraft permanently places the country that sold it in a position to condition its use. Elections change. Leaders change. The software dependency in 8 million lines of code does not change with any election. Now the alternative, because the debate is not simply about what Canada is walking away from, but what it is walking toward. The Saab Gripen is combat-proven. It operates in Brazil, Sweden, and several other nations without any dependency on an American software team. No mission data files controlled from Florida. No update schedule managed at Eglin Air Force Base. Canada would control its own jets fully. Pilot training, maintenance, software updates, mission planning, combat employment. The decision about whether the aircraft is ready to fight would be made in Ottawa, not in Florida. The Project Plowshares report, published by a Canadian Defence Research Institute in 2025, found that the United States receives nearly 70% of all F-35 production subcontracts, 70%. Despite the program claiming that partner nations share manufacturing benefits proportionally. Canada is not simply buying an aircraft. Canada is subsidizing American manufacturing while accepting permanent dependence on American operational decisions. The $19 billion purchase price is the visible cost. The invisible cost is the permanent structural subordination of Canadian Air Force operational independence to American political discretion. Davies framed the strategic question precisely in Parliament. Purchasing F-35s will deepen our military integration with a superpower, not reduce it. That sentence is not an argument against military capability. The F-35 is genuinely capable, more capable than the Gripen in specific high-end scenarios involving penetration of sophisticated integrated air defense systems. The argument is about sovereignty, whether a country should hand its national defense to a partner that has proven repeatedly and publicly that partnership comes with conditions. Mark Carney articulated the strategic framework at Davos in January 2026. It is time for middle powers to unite against what he called weaponized economic integration. The F-35 cancellation push is the defense application of that framework. The question Carney raised in the economic domain, whether dependency on a dominant partner's systems and infrastructure creates vulnerability that can be politically exploited, applies with equal force to the military domain. The LNG Canada terminal routing gas to Asia rather than south is the energy version of the same principle. The Gripen consideration is the defense version. Now Germany, because this is where the story moves from Canadian domestic politics to the architecture of Western defense. Germany ordered 35 F-35s, $8.3 billion, first delivery scheduled for next year. Wolfgang Ischinger, former head of the Munich Security Conference, Germany's former ambassador to Washington, one of the most connected and credible voices in German-American diplomatic relations, a man who spent his entire career building the transatlantic alliance, told Bild, Germany's largest newspaper, if we should fear that the U.S. would treat future German F-35s the way they treat Ukraine now, then contract cancellation may be considered. Contract cancellation, $8 billion, from the person who most invested in maintaining German-American defense ties. That statement is not a political provocation. It is a sober assessment from a career diplomat who understands exactly what the words mean and chose them deliberately. The fact that Ischinger said it publicly, in Germany's largest newspaper, tells you that the conversation is happening at the level where German policy is shaped, and that the conclusion being reached is no longer confined to opposition voices. Lockheed Martin projects 650 F-35s operating in Europe by 2035. Hundreds of billions in revenue from spare parts, training programs, maintenance contracts, and the strategic influence that comes from being the supplier of the equipment that European militaries depend on. SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, found that 55% of all European arms imports now come from the United States, up from 35% 5 years earlier. That share represents decades of relationship building, reliability, and the demonstrated willingness to supply partners without political conditions. It represents the trust architecture that made American defense exports dominant in European markets. That trust architecture is the thing that changed, not the technology. Technology improvements are negotiable. The F-35 is still more capable in specific domains than any European alternative, but countries buy weapons systems for 30 to 40 years. The relevant question is not whether the technology is good today. The relevant question is whether the supplier will be a reliable partner for the entire duration of the aircraft's service life, which includes administrations that do not yet exist, political conditions that cannot be predicted, and policy disputes that have not yet materialized. Countries that watched Ukraine's F-16 situation and Canada's aviation tariff threat made a calculation about that question, and the calculation is changing. The permanence dimension is the most important element that the coverage keeps treating as background. When a country purchases fighter jets, the decision locks in for 30 to 40 years, not because of contractual obligation. Contracts can be canceled, as Germany's defense planners are now openly discussing, because of infrastructure. Pilot training programs redesigned around one aircraft's specific characteristics. Maintenance facilities built to service one platform's specific requirements, weapons integration work that embeds specific missile systems, targeting pods, and communication protocols into one aircraft's architecture, supply chains that connect one country's manufacturers to one aircraft's parts requirements, military doctrines written around one aircraft's specific capabilities and limitations. All of that infrastructure takes years to build and years to reverse. If Canada switches to the Gripen, Swedish engineers train Canadian pilots for the next 40 years. Swedish factories supply Canadian parts for the next 40 years. Swedish systems integrate into Canadian defense networks for the next 40 years. American companies are out of that relationship permanently. Not until the next political cycle, not until the next administration, permanently, for the operational lifetime of those aircraft. The revenue, the relationships, the strategic influence that flows through the supply relationship, gone. The historical proof that this permanence is real comes from Turkey. In 2019, Turkey purchased Russian S-400 missile systems. America kicked Turkey out of the F-35 program entirely. No jets, no parts, no access. 7 years later, Turkey still has not come back. The relationship has not recovered. The departure was permanent. Turkey was expelled. The current dynamic is different. Allies are not being expelled. They are choosing to leave. But the permanence of the outcome is identical. Once the infrastructure of an alternative defense partnership is built, it does not disassemble because the political dispute that motivated its construction resolves. The Swedish engineers training Canadian pilots do not go home when American-Canadian relations improve. The Saab maintenance contracts do not dissolve when a new American administration takes office. The manufacturing jobs created in Ontario and Quebec by the Gripen deal's industrial offset commitments do not disappear because Washington eventually decides to moderate its approach. The EU's $162 billion defense spending commitment is the macro-level confirmation of this dynamic at continental scale. European missiles, European drones, European cyber warfare programs, not because European technology is definitively superior in every domain, but because European weapons do not come with political conditions attached. The investment in European defense industrial capacity is explicitly motivated by the calculation that dependency on American supply creates vulnerabilities that European governments are no longer willing to accept. That calculation was available before this period. It became politically executable because of this period, because the actions taken toward Canada, toward Ukraine, and toward other allies made the cost of dependency visible in ways it had not been when the dependency was assumed to be safe. Here is the honest assessment that the coverage needs to include, because the Gripen's advocates can oversimplify as much as the F-35's defenders. Canada's Air Force commander told Parliament that the F-35 is the only aircraft that can counter Russia and China in high-end contested airspace. She is probably correct on the specific technical question. The F-35's stealth capabilities, sensor fusion, and ability to operate inside sophisticated integrated air defense systems provide advantages that the Gripen's fourth-generation design cannot replicate in those specific scenarios. If Canada's most likely high-end threat scenario involves penetrating advanced Russian or Chinese air defenses, the F-35 is the more capable instrument. The counter-argument from the sovereignty perspective is not that the Gripen is more capable, it is that capability is inseparable from operational control. An aircraft that is more capable but cannot be guaranteed to be operationally available, because the country that controls its software decides to condition that availability, is less effective in practice than an aircraft that is fully under Canadian operational authority. The capability question and the sovereignty question are not competing considerations. They are entangled, and the entanglement was made visible by the Ukraine situation in a way that no amount of alliance reassurance can fully resolve. Here is what you should be watching. Watch Germany. Ischinger's statement is the leading indicator. If German Defense Ministry officials begin using similar language, if the conversation moves from a former ambassador's newspaper interview to official government deliberation, Canada will have the political cover to follow, without appearing to be making a unilateral break with the Western defense architecture. If Germany modifies or cancels its F-35 order, the cascade dynamic that every defense analyst is privately discussing becomes publicly operational. Watch whether Canada announces any European defense procurement alongside or instead of the F-35 decision. Smaller European contracts, missile systems, radar components, training aircraft that begin routing defense spending toward non-American suppliers without requiring a full F-35 cancellation are the hedging signal that tells you the strategic direction has been decided, even if the headline contract is being deferred. Watch Lockheed Martin's lobbying posture toward the Canadian government. The intensity and nature of that engagement will tell you how seriously the company assesses the cancellation risk. Quiet technical briefings mean they believe the relationship is manageable. Emergency executive-level engagement means they believe the contract is genuinely at risk. Watch the Saab industrial package negotiations. The 12,600 jobs in Ontario and Quebec that Saab is offering as part of the Gripen deal are politically significant in the provinces that determine Canadian federal election outcomes. If those negotiations become more detailed and more public, the political infrastructure for the Gripen decision is being built simultaneously with the diplomatic groundwork. The 8 million lines of code in the F-35 are not going to change. The 90-person team in Florida is not going to relocate to Ottawa. The structural software dependency is permanent and architectural. It was designed that way for reasons that made sense when the alliance operated under consistent norms. What changed is the demonstration that the norms are not consistent, that the dependency can be weaponized, that it already was against Ukraine in wartime, and that Canada watched it happen. Canada building an exit from that dependency is not a break with Western defense. It is a Western democracy making a sovereign calculation about the difference between an alliance and a dependency, and deciding that $19 billion is too much to pay for the latter dressed as the former. Germany is watching. The 15 other countries that fly the F-35 are watching, and the 8 million lines of code that run from Florida are the reason they are all asking the same question.